Perfect. Okay. So welcome to the last webinar of the series organized by Alma during 2021. As most of our audience already knows, Alma is a Spanish acronym of Latin American Magnetism Association. And in case you're interested and you're not still a member, you can join us and participate in different activities of interest for researchers in magnetism and magnetic materials. We also have a monthly newsletter to which you can subscribe by emailing us to be added to our distribution list. We hope we can soon include our other nodes from other Latin American countries. So far, we have members from Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. And this year's webinars committee was composed by these members, the ones that are shown in the slide. And I would like to thank all of them for their hard work in organizing the 10 webinars of this year. And with today's talk, as I told you before, we're closing a chapter, and I can say it has been a great pleasure for me to have worked with this team. As it is usual, you will be able to find our previous webinars in our YouTube channel, as well as today's talk. And so our speaker for today is Luis Balicas from the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory and the Department of Physics of Florida State University. Luis was born in Brazil, but had his degree in physics in the Universidad Nacional Central de Venezuela in 1991. He had his master's degree in 1992 and his PhD in 1995 from the University of Paris, recently renamed Paris-Saclay in Orsay, France. He stayed in the group of Denis Geron, working as a postdoc on superconductivity of organic compounds, and returned to Venezuela in 1996 to the Instituto Venezolano de Investigaciones Científicas for about 3 years. He finally landed in the MagLab, his current position in Florida, and has been there for the past 23 years. He has co-authored over 270 publications, leading to a Hirsch index of 55. Thank you so much, Luis, for agreeing to be here today, presenting your talk, Magnetic Field-Induced Non-Trivial Electronic Topology in Iron Germanium Tellurium. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. Primero, decir algunas palabras porque, bueno, yo voy a dar mi seminario en inglés, que de hecho di un seminario en Bariloche recientemente y en español me costó un poco. Pero para aquellos que quieran hacer preguntas en portugués, como en español, serán muy bienvenidos. No habrá problemas en que las discusiones pueden ser el idioma. Nevertheless, right now I'll switch to English. Let me share my screen because this is the international language, the scientific language. And it's more convenient for me to use English to talk to you. So today I'm going to talk about results that we published this year in iron 3 germanium tellurium 2, what I'm claiming to be a magnetic field-induced non-trivial electronic topology associated with real space spin textures, and that are observable in this compound. So this was published in this Applied Physics Reviews, and this is work supported by the Department of Energy. So there are a number of students that have been involved in this research and also postdocs. We interacted strongly with Ansang Choi here at the MagLab for the thermal transport. Samples were characterized via X-ray by the group of Shatruk at the chemistry department here. Also, additional X-ray data collected from Julia Chan's group at University of Texas, Dallas. We had simulations, I'm going to talk and mention a little bit about those done by the group of Elton Santos, currently at the University of Edinburgh, and some neutron data, preliminary neutron data. We have more neutron time coming to continue to study this compound and try to understand a little bit better the spin textures we see in it. So the outline of this talk is simple. I do not think I have time for point 3 and point 4. If I go too fast, maybe, but it's basically to discuss, I will introduce the properties of iron 3, germanium, tellurium 2, and discuss the electrical and thermal transports, and discuss the role of spin textures. If time permits, which I doubt, I will talk a little bit about unpublished results in iron 512. So iron 312 is a layered material that crystallized the sp6-3 MMC structure, and the iron atoms make sort of a triangular arrangement in the lattice. If you measure the susceptibility displaced Curie-wise at higher temperatures, and you extract an effective moment of about 3 mu b, actually this is akin to what neutron scattering says that you have for the effective moment of iron in this compound. At about 210, 215 Kelvin, there's a jump in the magnetization. The material undergoes a ferromagnetic transition. There seems to be additional transitions which we do not know very well what they are, because they don't leave clear thermodynamic signatures in the heat capacity. I'll show the heat capacity in a moment. So the magnetism in principle is very simple. What neutrons say is that we have just a collinear arrangement. I'm just putting my pointer here. A collinear arrangement of magnetic moments along the c-axis. So this material caught my attention because I have been working in two-dimensional materials. It's dissolvable like graphene, presumably you can achieve monolayer. You can go from bulk, 3 tri-layers, bilayers to monolayer in exfoliated compound. What has been published already 3 years ago is that the Curie temperature decreases, the number of layers decreases. But one aspect that is interesting and intriguing about this compound, this was using what is called ionic liquid gating, is that you can increase the Curie temperature by applying a large electric field along the c-axis. The coupling between the electric field and the magnetic moment is still a matter of debate, but you would be able to tune the magnetic properties of the electrical signal. Now, if you measure magnetization as a function of magnetic field, as a function of temperature, you see the typical behavior of a ferromagnetic compound with a step-like function in the magnetization. The c-axis, the z-axis, the compound just need a very small magnetic field in the order of 0.1 Tesla or so to saturate the magnetic moments. If you measure the Hall effect, one of the things we're going to discuss today, you see the Hall effect mimics the magnetization. Follow a step-like function, you're observing an anomalous Hall effect. Anomalous Hall effect, the Hall effect in a ferromagnetic compound characterized by strong spin coupling has the conventional term, the conventional Hall effect, and there's a term that's proportional to magnetization, which is the anomalous Hall effect. The anomalous Hall effect has already been discussed at length in several papers, in particular in this Nature material published in 2018, and they claim to extract this constant RS being the largest ever reported for any compound. Now, one intriguing aspect of this compound we're going to discuss today was already analyzed and discussed in this manuscript here in 2017, this PRB, that if you put, let's say the current, the materials grow like platelets. You can put the magnetic field along the plane of the platelet. You can pass current perpendicular to the planes. And when you do so, you observe an extra component in the Hall response. Is this peak that you see here. And they claim that this has something to do already with what we call spin chirality. Spin chirality is a scalar. It acts as an effective magnetic field, is associated with this non-coplanar spin texture of the magnetic moment when apply a magnetic field in the plane. But this spin textures in real space scatter electrons, and they scatter electrons force electrons to perform non-trivial trajectories in K-space. This gives something else inside, in addition to this step-like function they expect in the anomalous Hall. You have an additional contribution that gives this peak that you see here. So, oh, my screen froze. Okay, sorry for this, folks. screen froze. So the large anomalous Hall response in this material was claimed to have something to do also with electronic topology. They did band structure calculations of these nature materials in 2018, and they see the certain bands cross and meet what would be a Dirac point. If you include the spin-orbit coupling and presumably the actual magnetic order of this material, you would gap the nodal line. It would go from the K point to the H point in the Brillouin zone. It would form a nodal line. It gaps, but you're left with a non-trivial texture of the Barry curvature. And this texture of the Barry curvature would contribute in their hypothesis to a very large anomalous Hall response observed in this compound. Now, iron 312 could be topological, but as a unique compound in the other sense. It's also some sort of heavy fermion compound. This is heat capacity measured in my group. If you measure iron 312, you see just one clear anomaly. I want you guys to keep this in mind. There's only one clear anomaly in heat capacity, 215 Kelvin or so, depends on the actual transition temperature depends on the iron content. You guys need to keep in mind the iron is not fully stoichiometric in most of the samples. It ranges from 2.75 to 3. So there's some dependence of the Curie temperature on the iron content. The higher the iron content, the higher the Curie temperature. So for this sample, for example, it's about 215.5 Kelvin. And an important point is that if you measure heat capacity normalized by temperature versus the square of the temperature, you will see a linear dependence intersects at about 120 millijoules per mole per Kelvin square. That's the electronic contribution to the heat capacity. And the electronic contribution to the heat capacity is very large. And that's what typically you see for heavy fermion compounds. The same is true for the iron 5 germanium tellurium 2, the sister compound that I believe I will not have time to discuss today. We see several anomalies. There's a magnetostructural transition around 116 Kelvin. But again, if you plot the heat capacity normalized by temperature versus T squared, you see a linear behavior. And then the intercept gives you about 100 millijoules per mole per Kelvin square. So these compounds are not just possibly topological, as we're going to discuss today. They are also strongly correlated. And there are some folks that published a Science Advances a few years ago, claiming that they observe a very strong transfer of spectral weight. This is the ARPES data collected at 300 Kelvin. 80 Kelvin, they see a dip developing, a peak developing close to the Fermi level. That's typically what you see for heavy fermion compounds characterized by rare earth elements, where you have the F bands hybridizing, let's say, with D bands. They form very shallow bands close to the Fermi level. This very large density of states tend to lead to very massive fermions. So they claim that these compounds might be developing something akin to a condola, this like in heavy fermion compounds, although this is not a rare earth element. One intriguing aspect we're going to discuss today is the magnetic domain structure of this material, and that how it affects the topological properties. This is magnetic circular dichroism imaging. As you cross the Curie temperature, you see the development of what they call labyrinthine or serpentine domains. This is very intriguing. We're going to talk at length about it today. Another intriguing aspect about this compound, if you apply a magnetic field, is observation of magnetic bubbles or skyrmions. And skyrmions typically have sizes that range from few angstroms to tens of angstroms. But here, what is claimed to be skyrmions have very large size in the order of 200 nanometers or so. And it's very intriguing to understand because to form skyrmions, you need higher order couplings like biquadratic exchange interactions and so forth, but I also would need a little bit of the Shelley-Shinsky-Morier interaction. If to have the Shelley-Shinsky-Morier interaction, you have to lack inversion symmetry. But this lattice, iron 312 is 663 mmC, is inversion symmetric. And there's some discussions as where the Dichello-Schitzke-Maria interaction is coming from. Now, what I'm showing here is the anisotropy of the magnetization. And what I need you guys to keep in mind this figure here. This is the z-axis of magnetization, as I mentioned before. And this is the hard axis of magnetization, the AB plane. Now, all you see in both cases is a continuous increase in the magnetization until it desaturates. For fields along the c-axis, you need very low fields. For fields along the AB plane, you need fields in the order of about 5 Tesla, 4 to 5 Tesla, so to saturate the magnetization. This is neutron data that I'm showing in the panel C and D that we included in our manuscript. And it was important that we did this neutron scattering data because of this complex structural domains, how they would be affected by the magnetic field. So what do we see? Unfortunately, my neutron colleagues did not do exactly what I wanted, but this is the peak area that includes the Bragg peak associated with the crystalline structure, but also includes a Bragg peak associated with the magnetic structure. So when you apply fields along the AB plane, what you see is the moment along the c-axis decreasing, and the moments along the AB plane increasing this material, according to my neutron scattering folks. So you basically see something that mimics the magnetization. It is important because someone speculated with me that applying magnetic field in plane could reorient the domains in a different direction. It could have non-trivial texture for the magnetic moments. What we only see is the magnetic moments decreasing in plane, outer plane, increasing in plane. And the reason why I'm discussing all of this is because we talked about the serpentine domains in the previous slide. And we do not know exactly what the spin texture in these domains are. They could be something akin to what Elbow Dagoto published in 2020, that you could have some sort of chiral or conical spin order, where the moments going from one magnetic domain to the other magnetic domain would have some very complex texture, giving again origin to the spin chirality. Finally, one aspect that's interesting about this compound, and again could open opportunities for applications, technological applications. So there's some report here in ACS Nano last year for the group of the Wang Kang from University of California, Los Angeles, where they grew iron 3 germanium tellurium on bismuth telluride, which is a topological insulator, which is characterized by strong spin-out coupling. There's some interfacial transfer spin-out coupling to the iron 312. And they claim, as they exfoliate the material, but not exfoliate, they grow the material with thinner and thinner layers, that as the layers become thinner and thinner, the Curie temperature increases dramatically as it's grown on bismuth ditelluride, surpassing the room temperature, approaching all the way up to approximately 400 degrees Kelvin. So it could be a ferromagnetic layer compound that can be grown in large area by MB, displaying relatively high Curie temperature. So let me talk about our experimental results. As I said, we're going to characterize the material via neutrons, magnetization, and transport, electrical and thermal transport. So in panels A and B, I have one crystal where we measure magnetization. Field cool is the brown trace here. Clear blue is the zero field cool data. The markers here, the brown markers, is the neutron data that we collected, the magnetic moment, so confirm that the material would be a simple collinear ferromagnet along the c-axis. And this red line is some mathematical formula with some critical exponent, somewhat mimics the behavior of neutron. This is all explained in our manuscript. And in blue, we have the results of some simulations. And I'm going to talk about the Hamiltonian that gives or explains the emergence of this magnetization at about 203 Kelvin. So what is intriguing here is that if you take the derivative of the magnetization as a function of temperature, and I have here two samples, sample 1 and sample 2, you clearly see the Curie temperature at about 204 Kelvin, And the sample, 203 Kelvin, the sample is the middle point of the ferromagnetic transition. But you also see at intermediary temperatures some additional anomalies in the derivative, suggest that the material could have additional transitions, although, as I showed you before, the heat capacity does not reveal any anomaly at these temperatures. You only see them in the magnetization. If you measure resistivity, the resistivity just sees a kink at Curie temperature and saturates a relatively high residual resistivity. It's not a very good conductor. There's a lot of scattering of carriers there. If you measure thermal conductivity, on the other hand, you see some broad features at the Curie temperature and additional broad features that more or less coincide with these anomalies in the magnetization. We don't know exactly what they are. You can also measure the Seebeck coefficient, and the Seebeck coefficient mimics the behavior of the thermal conductivity, showing broad anomalies at these temperatures. You can, from, if you know the thermal conductivity, if you know the conductivity, because we have measured the resistivity of the material, you can calculate what is called the thermoelectric conductivity term, which basically mimics the thermoelectric effect. So there's some textures here, some additional subtle transitions according to both magnetization and thermal transport, which I'm speculating could be changes in the configuration of magnetic domains in this material. Now, if you measure the Hall effect, this what I have here is not Hall effect, Nernst effect, and thermal Hall all measure in the same sample simultaneously, or near simultaneously. And we use a pulsed technique, a pulsed electrical current, pulsed thermal current, to minimize the self-heating of the sample. So as you see, the Hall effect in the sample measured through this pulsed method just increases and saturates because we have an anomalous component proportional to magnetization. You see the same thing with the Nernst effect and the same thing with the thermal Hall, which, by the way, is very large in this material compared to many other compounds. What is intriguing is that the Nernst effect, actually, as it goes down in temperatures, change sign. And that's highly non-trivial. In this panel D, I plot the Nernst effect that we observe at 1 Tesla as a function of temperature. And what you see is the Nernst effect increases across the Curie temperature, seems to show some sort of plateau, and then crashes down and change sign at about 50 Kelvin, while the thermal Hall shows two broad anomalies in the same positions that, as I mentioned you before, we saw sort of anomalies in the magnetization, although the heat capacity does not really review any additional phase transitions at these anomalies here. If you look at the Hall effect increases, and then around 50 Kelvin, something happens also. It decreases slightly, although the magnetization continues to increase, it goes down in temperature. So there's something fundamental happening around 50 Kelvin. And if you go ahead and, since you know your Nernst effect, and you know your alpha x-axis, which you calculated in the previous slide, I can evaluate alpha xy, the off-diagonal thermoelectric conductivity tensor. And this alpha xy, the off-diagonal thermoelectric conductivity tensor, is directly proportional to the Berry phase of the charge carriers in K space. The simple integral over the entire Fermi surface for all the occupied bands. If you do that little calculation, alpha xy, change sign is slightly, it's a slightly negative at high temperature. Change sign when you cross the Curie temperature follows a plateau, and around 50 Kelvin completely change sign. So how to understand this change in sign and alpha xy? The only way I can understand this change in sign and alpha xy is a very dramatic reconfiguration of the Berry curvature. The change in sign at high temperatures can be attributed simply to the thermodynamic transition. There's a change in entropy, and the change in entropy will change the behavior of xy. But as I showed you before, the heat capacity shows no anomaly at 50 Kelvin for iron 312, and nevertheless, we see a very dramatic change in the sign of the off-diagonal thermoelectric conductivity tensor. So this change in sign cannot be attributed to change in entropy. It has to be attributed to a reconfiguration of the barrier curvature in all the occupied Fermi surface and bands if it is completely electronic. And how to understand that? That's actually a topological transition and not necessarily a thermodynamic transition. So I'm not sure how to explain this unless there's a very dramatic reconfiguration of the magnetic moments in real space that affects the barrier curvature of the charge carrier. So I'm showing you an evidence for what I believe is a topological phase transition of unknown origin in iron 312. Now, one intriguing question when you measure these anomalous variables is if this material satisfies the Wiedemann-Franz law, which tells you that the same charge carriers that conduct electricity are the ones that conduct heat, and the ratio between the thermal conductivity and the electrical conductivity when normalized by the temperature should be the Lorentz number. There's a big question about the application of the Wiedemann-Franz law to the anomalous variables, anomalous thermal Hall and anomalous Hall conductivity, the ratio between the two, if it is would be still applicable. And this debate is relatively recent. Some measurements, for example, in a magnetic compound that became famous, manganese 310, is a very intriguing, very interesting compound that has a sort of a Kagome lattice in a certain way, a triangular lattice. And it orders antiferromagnetic, a non-trivial order in the plane. It's very interesting because you apply a magnetic field to see a very large anomalous Hall and Nernst effect at room temperature. So some results suggest that manganese 310 would more or less within the error bar satisfies the Wiedemann-Franz the Lorentz number. That's what some folks claim. Others claim there are deviations for a sister compound at higher and higher temperatures. So it's a little bit debatable if the Wiedemann-Franz law would be satisfied for the anomalous variable. So we did this exercise here because if you get kappa xy, the anomalous thermal Hall, and divide by temperature, you see there's a lot of structure here. There's this broad anomalous that we saw before. If I take the ratio respect to the Hall conductivity that we determine in our samples, it would seem that something would happen, there would be a dramatic deviation. When in reality, when we take the ratio between the two, well, in first approximation, the system still seems to satisfy the Wiedemann-Franz law, perhaps with some mild deviation here. We put very conservative error bars here. You see that some points that deviate clearly, that it gives us an idea of the error bars of instrumentation in our measurement. So in first approximation, at least iron 312 in the range of temperatures from low temperatures to 125 Kelvin seems to more or less satisfy the Wiedemann-Franz law, which came as a little bit as a surprise, given that I seem to have found a topological phase transition. So the point I want to discuss with you is actually this surprising observation here. If you get iron 312, you put Hall contacts, you pass current, let's say, along the A-axis and apply magnetic field along the A-axis. There's no Lorentz force. There's no interaction between the magnetic field and the electrical current. I repeat, there's no interaction between the magnetic field, no Lorentz force, and the electrical current, which is what you need to observe a Hall effect. Nevertheless, if you apply magnetic field in plane and in a Hall effect configuration, you see a clearly antisymmetric signal, like a Hall-like response in a material in the absence of Lorentz force. You can rotate your sample by 90 degrees. Now, your current will interact with the magnetic field, but should I give you a voltage in this phase on the opposite phase, you still see a large antisymmetric Hall-like signal. There's hysteresis at low temperatures because the material is ferromagnetic. And the important point is that this signal is comparable. We're talking about 6 micron centimeters. If you go back, we were measuring about 10 micron centimeter in saturation for fields along the C-axis. So this very large signal here is comparable to the signal along the C-axis, although we have taken extreme care to align the samples very, very well with respect to the plane and the magnetic field. They make the A-axis very well aligned to the magnetic field. And to be fair, I was so perplexed about these measurements that we took a long time, measure multiple samples, et cetera, to be sure when we saw this was real. And we observed this in about 2018, and turns out, because I was taking so many precautions before I want to report this, that another Chinese group published similar observations in 2019 for the Hall effect, or Hall effect-like signal for fields along the axis. What is important for you to keep in mind is that this is not a simple anomalous Hall, because it's an anomalous Hall, remember, should follow magnetization. And the magnetization I showed you before just increased and then about 5 Tesla saturates. So this, if it has something to do with a component with anomalous Hall in plane, you should see a signal that increases in saturated. What we see shows a peak and then tend to decrease, but it does not completely disappear at about 9 Tesla. So if you take an antisymmetrization, you take curve from positive field minus the curve from negative field, you see this looks like the topological Hall signal that I showed you before, showing a peak. It increases linearly. There's some hysteresis at low temperatures, it increases linearly. You see a peak and then it tends to die. And if it has something to do with spin textures, because it seems that you're developing some sort of a spin texture, as you align the magnetic moments, you seem to suppress whatever spin textures create in this strange topological Hall. As this magnetic moment seems to be completely saturated along the field according to magnetization, you still see a strange Hall response in this material, a finite value of this novel type of topological Hall effect in this material. So we went ahead and repeat the measurements that we had done before for the C-axis. We measure anomalous Hall and the Nash effect and the thermal Hall. Again, pulsed methods, now with fields and currents, electrical currents and thermal gradients along the magnetic field. And all three variables behave in a very similar way. You seem to increase, reach a maximum value somewhere around 3 to 4 Tesla, and then it saturates, but does not, it crashes down as you align the magnetic moments, but do not completely disappear as you reach 9 Tesla, where the magnetization says that you have all the moments completely aligned along the field. So clearly, this behavior here suggests that we are developing some sort of spin texture. We reach a maximum, let's say, a texture that has spin chirality. You have a field-dependent spin chirality as you align the field, the magnetic moments along the field. You reach a maximum spin chirality at a certain value, and then as you start aligning the magnetic moments along the field, the spin chirality dies off, but you're still left with something that it gives you a strange novel type of a topological transport in this material in absence of the spin textures. So to understand the spin textures, Elton did some simulations for us. And here we have the Hamiltonian that he used, incorporates a biquadratic coupling between the spins, anisotropy, because the material is layered. Here you can see blue plane, a green plane, and a gray plane, just to indicate you have different layers of material. Coupling to the magnetic field, and just a coupling, a regular Heisenberg coupling between the moments where somehow he incorporated the Shevchenko-Marie interaction, this term here. So he's able to capture with the simulations the serpentine domains that we see in this material. What is important is, in orange, the moments are pointing down, in black, the moments are pointing up, but it's sort of white and greenish, the moments are in the plane of the material. And why is that important? Because you have spin up, spin down, spin the plane, you have a non-coplanar spin texture in this region, in the domain walls, according to his simulation. If you apply a magnetic field, he can see, if you're using this Hamiltonian, that he develops the skyrmions that have been observed before, and you can see the skyrmions would seem in his simulation to form a skyrmion tubes between different planes. So let me show a little bit. Let's see the simulation work. Come on. I guess I need to change my pointer. No. Let's see. As you can see, I showed again, this is just basically development of the spins as a function of the temperature in the simulations using this Hamiltonian, how eventually, as you go down in temperature, you develop this serpentine or labyrinthine domains with, as we're going to discuss, block domain walls. If you apply a magnetic field, we saw in the simulations, in agreement with what was published before, that the system has a tendency to develop skyrmions as the magnetic field increases. So here are the results of the simulation suggesting skyrmions. And if you go in our paper, we have calculated the topological number associated with both the skyrmions and the spin textures. There's an explanation how we calculate them. And here I'm showing an example of what a block skyrmion, an L skyrmion, and an anti-block skyrmion is for these materials. There's a problem with the simulations, though. I'm going to discuss with this in a moment. And before, I would just like to mention that when we apply fields in plane, according to the simulations, and we change the value of the biquadratic interaction, just a second, we do not see the labyrinthine or serpentine domains being completely wiped out by the magnetic field or from magnetic field all the way up to 2 Tesla. We have not extrapolated the simulations to 9 Tesla or so. So when we posted our paper in the archive, soon enough, we got a message from this gentleman here saying, oh, your results are very interesting. Turns out we have done Lorentz microscopy in iron 312. We have studied the domain walls in this material. We have seen very clearly the serpentine domains. And what we see is exactly what the simulations suggest, where you can see here a black, a moments pointing down, white, a moments pointing up, and the reddish are moments in the plane. You have basically a block type domain wall, spin up, spin down, with spins getting out of the plane in this material. And this domain wall texture has a finite spin chirality in real space. The carriers seem to be interacting with this block domain walls, performing non-trivial trajectories in real space and acquiring a non-trivial Barry phase in K space. That's how I understand this novel type of topological transport I'm just sharing with you. Now, this is preliminary data collected at post-sharing in Switzerland from our samples in collaboration with So Young Ah and an entire group that does photoemission electron X-ray, soft X-ray photoemission electron microscopy. This is an image of the domains in one of our samples. Look to the size of the domains, it's very large. We have this area here is about 20 by 20 micrometers. So the size of the domains here are on the order of several micrometers, 5 micrometers or so. But the more intriguing is that inside of each domain in our samples, we see a series of bubbles, big bubbles everywhere, distribution of bubbles. And the fundamental question if these bubbles are skyrmions, we have a distribution of skyrmions in our material with different quantum numbers. So this is work in progress. The simulations are being refined to try to replicate the spin textures. But as you guys can see, there's plenty of domain wall and the spin textures material to affect the transport properties. Now, even more intriguing, let's see, how am I doing my time? Okay. Even more intriguing is that we replicated some measurements in this material at higher temperatures. So 250 Kelvin, we are above the Curie temperature. We do not, in principle, have complex spin textures. And if you get the material, put Hall contacts and rotate the sample in plane, we see a clearly antisymmetric signal. Again, this is minus 3 Tesla blue curve, plus 3 Tesla is the magenta curve. So you see something that looks like antisymmetric Hall signal, but again, you rotate in the plane, you should not have any Hall signal. If you take the average between the two, that gives you the magnetic resistivity component in your signal, and the antisymmetric part gives you what would be a novel type of topological Hall. What is the problem? If I'm explaining that everything I saw before, I showed you before, this novel type of transport has to do with the spin textures. At 250 Kelvin, I'm in the paramagnetic state. again, I'm in the paramagnetic state. I don't have a spin textures, and it remains a big question mark where this large anomalous, truly planar Hall effect, antisymmetric planar Hall effect is coming from. Let me do a little clarification here. You guys work in magnetism, and probably you have used this in the past quite a lot, this so-called planar Hall effect to measure spin textures and isotropy. There's an example here of a manuscript published in PRL in some ferromagnetic compound that you put Hall-like voltage in the material, Hall-like contacts, you rotate the field in the plane, and you see a very clearly Hall signal, which in most cases, as discussed in this paper, is you're actually measuring an anisotropy of the magnetic resistivity with this Hall contacts. There's some theory out there and some analysis in this paper and multiple papers. And this planar Hall usually measures either a anomalous Hall contribution to this Hall conductivity, or measures the anisotropy of the magnetic resistivity if you have a magnetic domains. And this has been discussed a lot in the context of topological compounds. Cadmium-3 arsenic-2 is presumed to be a three-dimensional Dirac semimetal. Gadolinium bismuth platinum has been claimed to be a biosym metal. And there's some theoretical predictions claiming that depending on the tilting of these bio nodes, if you measure the planar Hall, should be very large, has something to do with so-called axial anomaly. I don't want to distract you guys now. And the periodicity would have something to do with the tilting of these nodes. No, in our case, we are not dealing with a biosym metal. And we are not measuring the anisotropy of the magnetic resistivity. We are looking to a truly antisymmetric signal in the paramagnetic state and a true Hall signal. What we call planar Hall before is a misnomer. Should not be called planar Hall effect at all. So 250 Kelvin, we see this sort of planar Hall. This is the average magnetic resistivity for different fields. You go to 150 Kelvin in the ferromagnetic state. As you can see, the amplitude of the things changes the functional magnetic field. And when you go to very low temperatures, you do see a planar Hall in the magnetic resistivity, the average of the two signals. So this is two planar Hall. This is the real antisymmetric Hall effect that you see in the system. So here, as you can see, as you go in the paramagnetic states, you go up in temperature, you see some sort of Hall signal in the plane that I don't have a very clear explanation its origin. Someone has suggested you could have ferromagnetic fluctuations of the material. You could have instantaneous spin textures that would contribute to this Hall effect associated with fluctuation. Perhaps when you cross the Curie temperature, the texture, this Hall effect changes completely. It shows a maximum somewhere around 3 to 4 or 5 Tesla, while in the paramagnetic state, it seems to increase and sort of saturate as increase the magnetic field. One possibility is that here, the topological character of the material in this region of temperature is dominated by the spin textures. And here, if those folks in Korea are right, they published that Nature material, this material has a Dirac nodal line that's gapped. It leaves some texture to barrier curvature. So perhaps I'm picking up some strange transport associated with the electronic topology. So this material would have two contributions to its anomalous transport: the real space spin topology and some electronic, non-trivial electronic topology associated with the barrier phase. So I think I was told to give a 45, 50 minutes talk. I'm approaching the 50 minutes line. So I'm going to summarize right now. So summary, we see a series of anomalies in the anomalous transport variables of iron 312. You transfer, for example, in one of them, the transverse thermoelectric coefficient alpha XY changes sign within the ferromagnetic state, indicating a possible topological transition. What is the origin for these anomalies that we see that don't show up in heat capacity? There's a reconfiguration of the spin textures. These are things we're trying to understand now through the neutron scattering measurements. Despite the topological phase transition and these complex spin textures, surprisingly, material seems to have satisfied the Wiedemann-Franz law. We see anomalous transport variables, topological, I will call them topological transport variables, for magnetic fields aligned along the gradient of chemical potential, electrical current, or gradients of heat gradient. We attribute those to the effect of possible spin chirality. I mean, we apply magnetic field, we manipulate the spin textures, we manipulate the spin chirality on the trajectory of charge carriers. They interact with spin textures, form non-trivial trajectories, and give novel transport properties in the material. Remarkably, we see an anomalous planar Hall also in the paramagnetic state. Here we're talking about true antisymmetric signal, pointing to possibly an electronic topological character for its origin. Therefore, we propose that there are two mechanisms contributing to the radar anomalous transport variables of iron 312. So thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Luis. I think we can all unmute our mic so we can thank our speaker. Very nice talk. And we open the session for questions.
I'm not sure I can hear.
I think
Hello?
Fernando. Yes.
Diego Rosales tiene la mano levantada. Bueno, empezamos con Diego porque lo puedo ver.
Bueno, sí, no lo veo, Diego.
Very much for
También
your
Mónica
very nice
Salazar
talk.
tiene la mano levantada. Sí, sí.
No veo a nadie. A ver. Sí,
Diego, veo a Mónica.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay.
¿Y que me puedes preguntar en español o puedes hablar en inglés?
Okay, I will try in English.
Let's try in English.
Okay. Thank you very much for your nice talk. It was very interesting, the results. So I have a question related with your Hamiltonian, effective Hamiltonian that you proposed to explain experiments.
Well, it's what we're using for the simulations.
Yes. I suppose that, okay, in your Hamiltonian, is not present the Jalosin-Kimerician interaction because you have explained why. So
yeah, you have to ask this question to Elton. He claims that somehow he incorporated the Jalosin-Kimerician interaction.
In these terms.
In this term.
Okay.
Exactly how they incorporated the Jalosin-Kimerician. It's a very small, the Jalosin-Kimerician.
Okay. No, my question
is. And actually, okay, bear in mind, again, as I said before, the simulations are not correct in the light of the recent results that we have, in the sense that domains here in the order of nanometers and the real domains in the order of micrometers. And these bubbles or skyrmions that they're getting, again, is the order of nanometers, while the bubbles that we are seeing orders of hundreds of nanometers. So they are undergoing a refinement of these Hamiltonian in an attempt to explain the recent observations.
Okay, good. Now, okay, my question was because I was thinking that in the case that you have not the Jalosin-Kimerician interaction, you will get two possible spin textures, one with one sign of the chirality and the opposite too, I think. No, but
it's possible. It's possible. In the fundamental question, you say that the one would cancel the contribution of the other. Possibly, I'm not sure. There's some folks that analyze as a PRB I can send you later that claim to analyze and explain the Jalosin-Kimerician interaction in this compound. I'm not fully convinced about their results yet. I think Skyrmi, if I understand correctly, and when he proposed skyrmions for nuclear matter many years ago, he didn't care about the Jalosin-Kimerician interaction at that time. All he cared about was higher couplings in the Hamiltonian, right? So we are not clear what is fundamental. I think the simulations will tell us what is most fundamental for these spin textures in this material. And what we explain the size of these domains and the size of these magnetic bubbles. I'm very intrigued. And one of the reasons why I'm intrigued is because we are seeing very similar results in 512. The sister compound, the magnetic moments order ferrimagnetic in the plane or ferromagnetic. And you would have anomalous nest even at room temperature.
Okay.
iron 512 with a lot of reversibility. And there's some folks in Japan that Santiago knows, Satoru, Nakatsuji, and others that are claiming that nest effect is a more effective way to harvest thermoelectric response, conversion of a thermal signal into an electric signal. And this is a direction I'm exploring. Perhaps some of these strange topological compounds could be a way of stabilizing a nest effect of room temperature that could have implications for thermoelectric conversion applications.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I guess next is Mónica.
Mónica, yes, now I see them. Thanks.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Te escucho. ¿Me puedes hablar en español si quieres o si quieres preguntar en inglés?
No, yo voy a hablar en español porque hay algo que no entiendo. Ustedes que, pues no sé si es importante o no, creería que sí, pero...
Toda pregunta es importante.
Bueno.
Claramente no, hay muchas cosas que yo tampoco entiendo de estas observaciones, así que somos dos.
Bueno, mi pregunta es, ¿qué estados de equilibrio están utilizando ustedes? Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿a qué se refieren con curvatura? Esas preguntas las hago porque hace poco esta semana estuve en un congreso de nanociencias en Chile, porque yo soy estudiante de doctorado en Chile. Y ellos estaban trabajando también, pues unas personas estaban trabajando con interacción inducida, Lusinski-Morilla, y efectivamente partiendo de un estado desordenado y pues aleatorio, encontraron texturas semejantes a estas que usted llama como serpientes o laberintos. Sí. Encontraron texturas semejantes, pero veo que usted en su trabajo menciona de estas interacciones de Lusinski-Morillas como una causa, una posible causa, ¿cierto? Entonces, no sé por qué todavía de pronto está la duda de, o sea, no creen que esto es suficiente, como que esta interacción es suficiente para explicarlos. Y la otra cosa es, la otra pregunta se la hice, es ¿qué tipo de curvaturas, qué cosa se refiere usted con curvatura?
BR, la fase de BR, curvatura de BR. Okay, si tú, eso es una fase geométrica, si tú, hay un pequeño ejercicio, sí. Tú puedes caminar por una esfera, ¿verdad? Un camino siempre puedes caminar tú puedes agarrar una escuadra y puedes hacer un pequeño ejercicio que está en Wikipedia. Si tú caminas un camino lineal, ¿verdad? Que tú bajas por un meridiano, sigue por un paralelo y después vuelve al mismo punto, como cortando. Esa escuadra, ese movimiento paralelo va a desarrollar un ángulo al final, una fase geométrica por el camino. Eso es lo que se llama la fase de BR, la fase geométrica cuando los electrones viajan por la estructura de bandas de material, dependiendo del material, ellos también pueden adquirir una trayectoria no convencional. Es como que si cuando tú aplicas un campo magnético, los electrones hacen órbitas que son ciclotrón, ¿no? Órbitas de tipo ciclotrón. Bueno, cuando tú estás rotando algo de manera geométrica, es como si estuviera aplicando un campo magnético efectivo. Entonces, es como si la estructura de bandas del material tiene un campo magnético efectivo, ¿ok? En este caso, lo que nosotros estamos diciendo es que tú tienes una estructura de spin que tiene una cierta chiralidad, y esa chiralidad no es un campo porque no es un vector, es un escalar, pero actúa de manera efectiva como un campo magnético y distorsiona, es que cuando los electrones interactúan con esa estructura de spin, hacen trayectorias que no son trivial en espacio y te dan cantidades que no deberían existir, como ese efecto Hall topológico, esa es mi explicación, en ausencia de una fuerza de tipo Lorentz. Eso es lo que trato de decir.
Sí, porque yo estaba haciendo la pregunta de qué tipo de curvatura, porque nosotros trabajamos con membranas que son curvadas, como nanocilindros, no ya las planas. Entonces en vez de DMI consideramos interacciones dipolares y de intercambio inducidas por la curvatura. Y precisamente las de intercambio sí se explican como una consecuencia de la fase de BR, aunque todavía no hemos hecho este tipo de, encontrar este tipo de texturas.
Bueno. Ok, no sé si respondió las preguntas que me
El
hiciste.
estado de equilibrio. ¿Qué estado de equilibrio están considerando?
Nosotros estamos trabajando siempre en semi-equilibrio, ¿no? Nosotros aplicamos un gradiente de temperatura, una corriente eléctrica, lógico. Es dinámico en el sentido de que está moviendo portadores, pero es casi estático porque las medidas son básicamente, no son en función del tiempo, son medidas esencialmente estáticas, ¿ok? No son medidas, no estamos haciendo medidas ópticas en el rango de frecuencias de gigahertz o terahertz o algo por el estilo, ¿ok? Entonces no son realmente medidas dinámicas, son medidas estáticas.
Ok, gracias.
De nada. Santiago, ¿a cuánto tiempo?
¿Cómo estás, Luis? Tanto tiempo.
So in English, in Spanish,
Your choice.
Scottish?
Scottish.
Yeah, then I cannot answer.
So, quick question then. Very nice talk, by the way. I liked it a lot. So, regarding the last issue, have you thought about experimental ways in which you can distinguish between these two, whether you can fine-tune between these two mechanisms, these two topological mechanisms you're looking at? Like, I don't know, like putting some...
I mean, if it would have something to do with the Barry phase or the spin texture particularly.
No, I mean, experimentally, whether you can do something like, I don't know, putting tension, uniaxial pressure, something like that, where you can decouple and try to mess with one and not with the other so that you can experimentally...
This is a very good point. Light. To be honest with you, actually, I have a postdoc now working with me that has a lot of experience in we're using this uniaxial strain cells, and we have some here in the lab, and we have them. And yes, we are trying to explore the role of strains, a very intriguing question, and trying to couple them, let's say, with thermal transport or perhaps even ARPAs or something like this. But what we are trying to do right now is a collaboration with the folks that will angle resolve the photoemission, to see if we can better understand, because the compound 512, which is, I didn't have time to talk, and on the other hand, this is still unpublished data, so I'm not sure I would like to have it recorded today. The 512, the magnetic order depends on how you anneal and quench the sample. And we have results collaborating with Yiming from Rice University, where some of the samples show slightly different topological response, depending if they are annealed or if they are quenched from high temperature. And the ARPAS data so far is showing that in some cases you have direct nodal line, and in other cases you wouldn't have direct nodal line. So we are approaching your question through the 512. We're trying to understand what the spin texture is with the help of Iona and other folks, argon and neutron folks. And then we're also trying to evaluate more precisely what the electronic band structure and possible topology really is in this compound at high temperatures, and try to correlate both things, not trivial, with transport properties that we are seeing. So it's a long term, it's a very intense project because it requires multiple samples and samples treated in different ways, and it requires ARPAs, and it requires XPAM, and requires Lorentz microscopy, and requires neutrons and thermal transport, you name it. So my postdoc is just afraid that it's become a gigantic project with a lot of information on different sites, and he just wants to publish, right? So yes, you're absolutely right. We are working on that, and we need to do more. Right now, in iron 312, we're trying to understand the spin textures, starting with, and then go back to the photoemission and try to understand a little bit better what is happening with those. Yes, a strain we're going to do, but I'm not clear how a strain is going to change the electronic band structure. Perhaps it gaps all the nodal lines. We would need to do photoemission and see what happens with everything. Or maybe enhances more the electronic topology nature of the material. Okay.
Okay, Gabriel, is there any question in the YouTube channel?
No, there is no questions in the YouTube.
I'm not dancing. I'm not a good dancer. I'm not a good singer, so nobody's watching me on YouTube.
I actually have a question, if it's okay.
That's okay, absolutely.
So regarding the planar Hall effect, the anomalous planar Hall effect that you saw in the paramagnetic state, And I
Right.
wonder if have you tried because it might be that you have some precursors of the magnetic transition even in the paramagnetic state, some sort of
That's what someone in Rutgers, when they gave this talk earlier this year at some other conference, that's exactly what he suggested, that perhaps you have some precursors and some fluctuations that actually give origin to this. This is a possibility, something that we have to study with neutrons, inelastic neutrons, small angle in the inelastic neutron scattering. And we do have 2 weeks of neutron time coming in Oak Ridge with my folks at NIST. So
it might
I
be not
hope we
visible.
have some. Sorry?
It might be not visible with neutrons. I guess it's a kind of very tiny signal.
Or it could be too fast for the time scales of neutrons.
Yes, I was actually thinking in ferromagnetic resonance, something that is really sensitive to small spins.
Do you perform ferromagnetic resonance?
I do, yes. So that's something.
If you want crystals, we can send you crystals. You can try to see if this is something above 250.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, sure. And,
so, and then one day, if the collaboration works, I have never been to Colombia. My wife is from Venezuela. I spent time in Venezuela, never crossed the frontier. So perhaps Colombia right now is looking much better than Venezuela in many aspects.
Yeah.
Sorry to say this, but it's a reality. And maybe one day I go to Colombia and get some Colombian food.
Let's make it happen then. Sure. Thanks, Luis. Very nice.
You're very welcome. Just my email. You just contact me, and I don't have any problems asking the samples to you guys.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yes. Further questions? If not, I'll just want to thank you again, Luis, for doing this talk, for sharing your research results. Very interesting results, really. And there's a lot done and a lot to do. So thank you for sharing. And
You're very welcome.
I thank all our audience and all the people in the webinar committee of 2021 who's been there organizing these talks and keeping the flame alive of this Latin American Magnetism Association. So I hope we'll meet again next year with a different organizing committee, but we'll be there absolutely. So
okay. Buenas tardes, boa tarde, todo mundo. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you guys. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks again.
Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.